that's another thing we don't do is we don't edit anything out of this. What you see is what you get. This is the final product whenever this is done. So thank you guys for tuning into Compound Performance Radio. Today with us, we have our guest, Kassem Hanson from N1 Education. Kassem, thank you very much for joining us today.
You're welcome. And I noticed that, from Texas, that 2 S's equal a Z still.
It does. Yes. Yes, it does. So, okay, number one, you guys all know at this point that the only question that we ask is what grinds your gears. And apparently we've now just switched that into mispronouncing Kassem's name. It's turning into Kassem as opposed to Kassem. So,
well, it starts with that. And then the next thing you know, that's, somebody names a product after you and spells your name wrong and they call it a Kaz handle. And
with
then,
the Z.
Where does it go from there, right?
And I think the next step for you is going to be legally changing your name.
Yeah.
That's all you got to do at this point. You just got to conform with what society wants you to do and just change your name to be that way.
Yeah. I'm going to change my name to Hip Thrust.
There you go. So off air, we were talking about how Kassem was saying he might just become the new glute guy because every time he posts anything about butts, he gets like 2,000 or 3,000 followers like immediately. Not a bad strategy.
Yeah. I mean, it's hard not to take the bait on that, but at the same time, I don't want to limit myself to only being able to, I should say, no disrespect, because definitely a little bit of disrespect to some people that say like, oh yeah, I just specialize in glutes. And I'm like, if that's setting the ceiling pretty damn low. And I don't want to set the ceiling that low for myself at this point. At that point in time, I think I would be like already ankle deep in the ceiling if I'm like, I only talk about glutes. Right? It's only a little bit of muscle.
It's not that much. Yeah. I mean, if we look at the evolution of like your content over the last like year, you were the squat guy when you were on the Rebel Performance podcast with us, and everybody was like just talking about like squats because that was when hingy squats were a thing, and squatty squats, and you became the squat guy talking about like, listen guys, there's more to it than just that. Then for a while you became the pull down guy, and N1 was only lats. And now it's like chest and butt. So like, it's just interesting. It's like wherever you seem to go, the industry seems to like angrily and begrudgingly follow you, talk a bunch of shit, and then forget about all of it that happened, and then just do what you were doing anyway.
It seems to flow in that, a lot of what we do is very different than the majority of the industry, which means
it's wrong, obviously. Yeah.
Because the foundation behind what we do is very simple. It's like we look at anatomy and we figure like how stuff works. Like this is the most this muscle can stretch. This is the most this muscle can shorten. A logical way to train that muscle would be to go between those 2 points. And that seems to be a really hard thing for a lot of people. But every time we put something out there that is, we'll say, new or divergent enough, it seems like that takes a life of its own and just kind of consumes our entire message for that brief period of time, as it will. And I don't know why my video just shut off for you. There we go. And so it's been cyclical. And honestly, the lats were the first. Well, no, the scapula I think was the first thing. And then we were the lat people.
Yeah.
And then, we launched squat wedges with, and the only thing we did is we took the big wedge and we cut it into little wedges so that you could match it with your feet. And then all of a sudden everybody wanted to argue with us about, heel elevated squats. And so we became the heel elevated squat guys. And I'm like, well, this is kind of cool. But you know what? I actually get no hate for any of the equipment that I designed, just for how I use it. Right.
Yeah.
Like, nobody hates on the inanimate objects, just like, oh, how dare you, stand on that and call it quads, or whatever. Right. And so it just kind of goes through. And so like, it seems to be that every time somebody big enough decides to try and disagree or whatnot, then all of a sudden there's this, this wave of, we'll say, debate, if you want to even call it that. And it just moves into the next thing. But I think every time we do that, we leave a little bit more of a footprint on the industry, right? Like how many years back, would it be before people started thinking like, oh, the lats are trained more in a sagittal, like wrap around the rib cage motion. Like that was a 2-year process to get people on board with that. And we're now just starting that message with pecs, and it's probably going to be another 2-year process before people are like, oh yeah, pecs go around rib cage too, but just other direction, right? But
It's
it'll
almost like they
eventually
can be
get there.
antagonists.
Yeah, exactly, right? It's almost like one thing pulls in the opposite direction of the other. It's so weird,
Like,
right?
shoulder extension and flexion, they kind of work opposite one another.
Yeah, it's
Yeah,
amazing how it
right.
works like that.
Mm-hmm.
But that's got to be a really interesting thing for you to just go through and like up front receive all of the hate about it, and just get all the people that are just grumpy and pissed off and like really just cognitively entrenched in their previous ideas and previous biases that are now being presented with new information that immediately threatens their status, not just like, because again, it's social media, so it's not just threatening their status as like a lifter or like an athlete. It's threatening their entire status as like a business person, and at the end of the day, as a human being, because they become so emotionally tied into something that like they just don't have the ability to look at it and just be more objective. And so what is that like for you, looking back on it and seeing now that like now 2 years later, people are starting to finally adopt or understand the stuff that you guys were talking about years ago?
It's definitely more rewarding looking at the progress that we've made than focusing on being in the thick of whatever the current debacle happens to be, right? And it's frustrating how this industry deals with change, because there's very few people that are trying to do new things, right? Like some people are just like, oh, it is what it is or whatever. But you have like some people that are doing new things, and it's basically meme worthy, right? It's like the people that aren't actually educators or experts in the industry. They're just coming up with novelty or whatever. And for the most part, that tends to get left alone because it's like basically meme worthy crap that like nobody even cares about. But all of a sudden, when somebody comes up with an idea that has some truth with it, that's where people get really threatened and defensive. And so that's kind of where we are. And it kind of sucks because it's like, somebody can come up with a way to like, contort and bondage themselves into something and completely waste their time. Nobody bats an eye. They're just like, oh, cool. Like, you're such an inspiration, right? And I'm just like, hey, how about we try and move this cable in the same direction as the muscle? And everybody gets pissed off, right?
That's not how it works. Do you ever look back at that and feel like Dennis from Always Sunny in Philadelphia, like eating a bowl of cereal in your car, just like, you dumb bitch?
Yeah. It does get to that point sometimes where I kind of wonder, like, you just get in that very isolated, like kind of, and it's a little bit egotistical too, but you're just like, God, am I literally the only one that thinks about this shit? Like, no, like I think about it all the time, and I don't expect that of everybody else, but sometimes I'm just like, I'll read something and I'm like, obviously like zero thought when it, like, I just feel like I'm surrounded by idiots. And that's, I mean, it's humorous, but it's also a very kind of like we'll say non-motivating place to be in the industry, because one of the things I actually love the most is actually having a real debate and a challenging conversation with somebody, and finding somebody that I can actually, it's like, okay, let me see if you can poke some holes in this, because at this point in time I need fresh eyes on it, and that's very, very hard to find right now, is people that actually want to debate this stuff. Everybody wants to fight about it, but nobody wants to debate about it, right?
Yeah. And I mean, that's definitely a thing that I've seen a lot like recently, is just the as soon as somebody starts bringing in any like fact or any just basic anatomy and physiology, or it's like talking about, again, like the lats, where people are talking about the lats role in a bench press. And it's like, well, the lats are just like extensions of the humerus, and like gravity would say that it's not really like, doing anything.
They're not doing anything concentrically. Really.
Yeah, they're not like, and like looking at things like that, and as soon as you bring like just basic joint actions that are well known and well talked about and well established by people, by many people in different areas, it immediately just resorts to like ad hominem attacks and personal attacks, and just like talking about how like you're weak or you're fat or you're small. And it's like, it's a de-evolution of the ability of people to communicate outside of their little echo chambers, which is a fascinating thing that's only, I think, gotten worse with COVID.
Mm-hmm. So the way I kind of look at it, and the reason that I think that this is going to be a problem for a while for us, is, I mean, I kind of look at it as that everybody else that's like very educated in this industry, maybe they're an expert, a guru, whatever you want to call them, right? Is they're essentially building this castle, but they're building it on top of a landfill. And the reason is all the pre-existing stuff that we have in terms of anatomy and whatnot, the quality of it and the accuracy of it is just, it's utterly poor. And nobody wants to get their PhD and then realize, you know what, I actually have to go back and look at basic anatomy, because that list of functions that was in the textbook or whatever that I learned or whatnot isn't a really good way of looking at it, and isn't a very accurate representation of what like the function is. Because I get in arguments all the time with physiotherapists, you know, and they'll be like, well, this muscle does this, and I'm like, what makes you think it does that, other than it like because say it's like, you know, the pec is an internal rotator, and I'm like, okay, it says that in the book, but do you actually understand the context in which the pec would have an internal rotation force? Because it's not like this humerus hanging on the body and just internally rotating the arm. And that, I think, is the biggest thing, is that whether it be people looking at research, whether it be people that are looking at, you know, programming, technique, whatever, is the foundation that the majority of the industry is working on is so poor. And that's essentially what we had to do. So it's almost like it's not a intelligence thing, and it's not a higher education thing. It's a foundational thing that is actually creating the most discrepancies. And most people will not take the effort to go backwards and rebuild that foundation, you know, 10 years later in their career, right? Like, how many people that have PhDs, I mean, they do come, but how many of them are going to be like, you know what, I'm going to go and take this anatomy course, you know, and learn how muscles work again? Like, when in reality, if they had that behind all of their other, like, you know, education and intellectual pursuit, they would have a much better perspective, and they would be able to use that knowledge so much better. And that's really the main advantage that we have with what we're doing right now, because it's pretty goddamn simple stuff. It just happens to be so much better than the majority of the stuff that's out there, because we went backwards. We were like, okay, what actually does this tissue do? What are the actual net forces, and how the nervous system comes? Like, let's just go to the basics of how this stuff works, right? The analogy that I use is, imagine that you took somebody driving a car, and you tracked their Google Maps or whatever, and you just saw where their car went all over the map. And then you use that to discern how a car works. That's essentially how most people are looking at how muscles work, right? Is they have this list of functions, and like, well, this does this, and it's an extensor, it's an adductor, blah, blah, blah. It's all of these things, right? And they look at this one map, and they're like, okay, well, it goes here and all of these other places. And I'm like, well, that's not how a car works, right? Like, you can't, like, well, okay, if I know everywhere that a car can go, does that then tell me how to build a car or drive a car or use a car? And that's essentially what we've done, is we're like, hey, let's actually forget everything that's in that list, and let's actually just go back and figure out what actually does this tissue do, like, from the internal mechanics out. And let's just train like that and see what happens. And so far, if we're looking at like biasing tissue, like making this thing the thing that works the most, in every lab that we've done, 100% of the outcome has been favored, that like everything else that matters in terms of training to failure, resistance profile, nothing trumps actually just moving in that line.
That's really interesting, because the implications of that, kind of like we talked about, threaten a lot of people's business model, right? Because you've got the whole like full range of motion, or train to failure, or submax crew, or like position is all that matters, and then like load and volume and intensity doesn't matter. We've got all of those camps that are very, very, very different and kind of incomplete in nature, where like if you're looking at it and just biasing the actual tissues and training them the way that you want them to, and setting up the exercise, it makes it really, really easy to just express max output, train to failure, get a higher degree of volume, and hit a better position, so you're not stressing as much like connective tissue or other passive structures as you would be if you were to just not give a shit about it. So it's one of those things where like the way that I look at that is like it could be a really good unifier of all of these concepts, but everybody's so angry with the fact that it's different that it's becoming more divisive than anything.
Yeah. And, we share, like, I probably share a little blame with that, with the language that we were using in the beginning was probably a little too absolute. But that's always the game that you play, right? Like, I mean, if you don't make it seem like this is really important, then nobody listens to it. But also, if you make it seem like it's really important, then somebody will want to point out like the one piece of context where it's like, well, if you run it through these 18 other hoops, then maybe that thing doesn't happen. And I'm like, well, okay, congratulations.
What about a blind youth soccer team?
Yeah. Right?
That's from another podcast. That's a question I got asked on training development on the need for like over queuing clients.
Yeah. What about blind youth soccer players? Like, oh, I mean, yeah.
Yeah. Right.
Explain it to them. Sure. Tactile information.
It's that whole thing of trying to argue the exceptions instead of the rules. And that's the limitation right now, right? Is just what it takes to have a conversation with people. And that's where, like I said, this is a problem that's going to be around for a while because foundationally there's such a difference between what we're doing and what most people are operating from, is there's a communication barrier. And that's even greater so in people that like don't have any education and aren't able to discern between what one person's saying and the other, right? Like if you don't have good foundation, you don't have a bullshit meter, right? You can't detect that, right? And so you just listen to two people and you're like, well, what he said makes sense and what he said makes sense, because you need the foundational information to be able to determine which one of those makes more sense, or in what context person A is right and what context person B, is right. And I think the only way that that's going to improve is if somehow we really start bringing up that foundational information. And I don't think that's going to happen, or at least it's not going to happen outside of what we're doing, unless some of these other people actually make the effort to, go back and do that stuff. And that's one of the reasons that we're doing the lab data, right? It's just like, can we make this sexy enough with actually providing like research-based level evidence that then it will be worth it for these people to be like, okay, now it's more evidence-based. Now it fits into my worldview. And so now I'm going to go and look at that. I mean, so a big portion of what we're doing from a research perspective is a lot of it just to kind of change the narrative in a way that people don't have to have a huge knowledge base to say like, okay, I will trust you after this, hour-long explanation in biomechanics. I will trust you that this is a good exercise. And I can just point at some lines and like, see, this line went up more than that one. And look at, we got some percentage points over here. And like, yeah, Moxie, cool things. And people just like, oh, this is awesome. This is amazing, whatever. And it's like, it's the same shit that I've been saying forever. I just did it with the fucking graph. That's like,
people love graphs, man.
People love, I mean, I think that's if people are going to change that complete narrative, I think they do, just especially from an egocentric point of view, they need the narrative, like they need the justification for that change. And I think how you're going about it is really smart, because that is the only way that I see you getting people to change their minds, in this industry, because people are, like Matt said, heavily invested in prior education and the information they put out, especially from a content perspective, right? Because you never want to say, oh, the stuff that I was saying a year ago, I don't believe that anymore.
Unless you're Luke Tulloch.
Yeah, unless you're Luke, which he was our last podcast, and I appreciate that a lot. But that's a rare thing in the industry, and so it's like you have to kind of come at them with overwhelming evidence to be able to do that. And I think eliminating some of these arguments before they're even started is a great way of going about that.
Yeah, for sure. It requires a lot of bandwidth and a lot of money, unfortunately, right? Like this morning, I was demoing $30,000 software to try and do some animations for some of the anatomy and stuff like that, like just to make this stuff more visually available to people, right? So that they can see, because right now people don't see anatomy in 3D and they don't see it in motion. They see it in 2D in one perspective, like this anatomical perspective. And we're limited to how many times we can travel around the world and draw on people and stuff like that. Right. So we're trying to see what we can do from a technological perspective right now, but we're very lacking in resources, and we're also very lacking in research. Like when it comes to training, hypertrophy, biomechanics, like we actually have so little, like so few data points, right? Like, so for instance, like the post that was put out today by Matt's favorite glute guy,
the only glute guy in my heart.
And this, I mean, I don't like to make any of this stuff personal, because I mean, it's not, it's just information, but like to say that, like, to make this, like the claim, like, oh, well, this exercise is higher on EMG than that exercise, therefore it must be the best. And I'm like, wait, so out of like the 100 things that we have, we tested 2. And then we just decided, well, if we got one higher and one lower, there, by nature, that is the worst, and this is the best out of all of the options, that we're just going to go with that. And I think that's a huge problem, is people are making these decisions off of a handful of data points. And the thing is like, you don't know, all 5 of those data points could be at the shit end of what's good and what's not, right? So you're picking, like, congratulations, you're picking the 5th worst thing instead of actually the best, just because there happens to be a data point for that. And most of the research and stuff, I mean, I appreciate all the research that there is, but in terms of like looking at mechanics and hypertrophy or whatnot, like a lot of the stuff, you really can't take much from it. Like you're just very limited, but people want to, like, they want to have that clear cut, like, well, this study proves that this is the way to do it, or whatever, right? I mean, we spent a good 4 to 6 months with our lab stuff, just trying to figure out all the ways that we could fuck up the test and fuck up the protocols and like cheat the system and whatnot, right? And it's amazing how sensitive and whatnot. And then you read the papers and like, these guys didn't account for any of that.
They didn't
right?
do
And
demographic controls.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And that's the biggest thing. Yeah.
The
demographic, right? And
anything.
And it's so funny, all of the research that is done on hypertrophy outcomes between exercises, or EMGs and biomechanics, and then you look at the, like, okay, what were the actual standards for the exercises, and were they even remotely close to what you would need, or were they even remotely close to how we're actually performing this? Like, I love like somebody will do a comparison between like heel elevation squats and flat squats, right? And they'll use like a 10-degree heel elevation for like an entire population. When in reality, it's like, okay, a 10-degree heel elevation in the majority of your population is about as equivalent as a pair of like regular tennis shoes half the time.
Where's some
yeah, right. So it's like, okay, well, what, like, and was there any technique involved in there at all, or was somebody just doing a hip dominant squat on a pair of stilettos, or like none of that stuff was accounted for? But the end of the study is like, well, what we found is like nothing happened. And I was like, well, yeah, that probably makes sense, because if you just change the environment like an imperceptible amount, and then you just ask people to fucking squat down and stand up, they're probably going to do it pretty close to the same.
Yeah. It's just amazing to me, because a lot of people, like you said, people in this industry like to put so much value in the evidence-based research, and you can tell no one's ever actually been in a lab, because they don't realize that like most of this is being performed by like college GAs who have no idea like what they're actually testing for the most part, and then very little control, or just even considering
a sample size of 6,
and then a sample size of like 6 to 10 people, and then they never even read the limitations of the actual study, right? Like it's like they go abstract, skip, discussion and application, cool, and we're done, and that's, and you're just like, man, like, you don't understand how to read actual research at all. And
there was one that I remember receiving a little while ago that was talking about hypertrophy for training, and it was like the subjects were quote unquote well-trained subjects in the abstract, and then you look at the actual population, you look at the demographic, and it was like, these people have been training on a training program for a minimum of 12 weeks, and it's like, oh, so they're still like brand new to exercise. and it was I think it was comparing like leg extensions to like squatting, and it was like this one had a better like stimulus response and like a better growth response in the quads. And it's like, well, they've also only been training for 12 weeks, so like how do you know if they can even do one of these effectively? Like they probably can't.
Well, it was just a minimum. So you could have somebody in there that was training for 12 weeks and another person that was in there that was training for 12
like 10 years. Yeah,
right?
exactly.
Like,
yeah.
You know?
Like these two people are not the same, and these two people are going to respond to stimulus and exercise very, very differently.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think we need to move in the direction so sample size for certain things, you need a very large sample size, right? For other things, and this is my opinion, and having done labs on the biochemistry side and now actually on the biomechanics side, is it seems that like you'd actually be better off if we did more things that had a small sample size, but were very tight controls. Because that's the thing, right? Is you go into in a bigger sample size, you lose the ability to controls. And I think we get more null hypotheses and more useless data. I would rather have a study on 4 people, but it was so constrained that like, look, we know this is exactly what happened. And, we got that, right? And then, if it's consistent across those 4 people, I'm a little bit more confident in that than, we did it on like 200 people and there's just data all over so it's like, okay, well, this is the average, but people were all over the place. So how confident am I in that average? Right. Cause like, what am I going to say?
Yeah. They took a round of buckshot to a piece of paper and it's all over the place. Like, what is this? What am I looking at?
So basically we don't if we can't get 100% consistency on the data that we're doing, then I assume that it's not right. Right. Like that something is existing outside of the variables. Right. So, and, that could be anything from like, okay, well, it could be like preconceived intent in somebody or whatnot. And it's like, so maybe we are making a difference, but the threshold is not enough yet, because I think that when we get things, when we really get things that work, the threshold should be that like, it's almost pretty much 100% in that direction. Like it's a very tight plot. It's not an all over the place plot. Now, when you start looking at things like hypertrophy and fat loss, which are very just like general, like multifactorial things, I don't envy what it takes to research that at all. But I would still prefer like a smaller, tighter controlled group in that. And I would prefer to actually say like, well, instead of like, okay, we trained these 10 people, and we did this very, constricted thing. I would actually like to see like, okay, now let's do something different within that same 10 people. Then let's just keep getting more and more people into this, because I think we get more data off of seeing inter-individual change and getting consistency across that than we do looking at population average response, especially because our goal is that we're always going to work with N of 1s. And so if we can always say that like, well, the magnitude may vary in things, but going from this direction to this direction always seems to yield an individual response in the same direction. That's a valuable thing that we can use as coaches in terms of how we're applying intervention. But we may not be able to say, well, look, if you do this program, it's going to be X percentage of, fat loss per week and this much percentage of lean body mass gain per week, on average. And that might not be helpful fucking at all unless you're training Joe average all the time.
I mean, and that's one of like our friend Ben House's like biggest thing when he talks about nutrition is like nobody has research on healthy populations either, and a lot of truly trained populations in a lot of these fields, and a lot of the research that we're looking at, whether it's hypertrophy based or rehabilitation based or whatever, like you just have no idea. Like there's very little research for people who have been in the gym for 12 to 15 years and are very trained in what they can expect from these training interventions in any way. And like citing materials for people who are untrained and conversations that the context is obviously around a trained population, which is what usually takes place on social media. Like the whole thing's ridiculous. Like as soon as I see citations pop up in threads, I usually just move on to scroll down to the next thing at that point, where it's like, you want to end this conversation, not actually continue it if you're just like posting these things most of the time.
That's one of the best things is when you're looking at studies that are on 80-year-old people who have never been active in their entire life. And like, this is applicable to like Jay Cutler. This will work the same.
Yeah. that's why you can hypertrophy anything as long as you just do 5 to 30 reps and during
Exactly.
of failure. Like that's all you need to do, right? I don't know why everybody isn't just walking around freaking jacked like
all the time.
It seems and the other side of that is a calorie surplus, and we know most people are in a freaking calorie surplus. So why isn't everybody just jacked?
We should all have like cyclist quads because we all have stairs in our house. Like that's just how it should work.
Everybody should be huge.
Yeah, just gigantic monsters. I stood out of a chair probably 6 or 7 times today. Hypertrophy. There it is.
Your glutes work. We know
Yes.
that now. They're activated. It's great.
But I hinged it so we know that they didn't actually
They
work.
didn't actually help you with that.
Yes.
Mm-hmm.
You should have laid back down and tried to hip thrust your way up.
Oh, that would have been, yep, there we go. That's how we get out of chairs from now on.
That would have been the way to do it.
It's like a fish out of water, but it's much more effective.
Yes.
Even better if you manage to compress and jam all of your joints at the same time while you're doing it.
If you band yourself a few times, you're good.
Mhm.
You're good to go.
I want 2 different bands that are the same tension so that I'm just buoyant. It'd be great.
Do you actually even need to do reps if you have bands?
I don't think so. I think you can just hold the isometric contraction and it just works.
Bands are constant tension, right?
Yes.
So
Well, you don't even need to do
bands.
anything. Exactly.
Sleeping
It's going to be huge.
Yeah. So I'm gonna do that. I'm gonna take over the weighted blanket industry. Just have people just wrap themselves in a giant condom. Just like,
I think that's the episode title is weighted blankets and giant condoms.
we use that's gonna be the one. I think
I think that's what it's going to be is weighted blankets and giant condoms.
See, we know how to market ourselves, guys.
Yeah.
It's gonna get some views.
It's definitely going to get some views. People are gonna be like, what is this about? What am I listening to?
Where can I buy one?
Yes.
yeah. We can call it the hypertrophy hugger, right? It's just like the huggy.
That's gonna be like the new pop-up ad when we go to your website in a few months, and I'm gonna be excited about it.
Yeah.
Just make sure you brand it appropriately so we get the N1 logos in places where people can easily see it when they're wearing it.
Yes.
Yeah. I mean, I'm sure as long as I put a graph behind it, I'm sure I could sell it.
You could definitely sell it. Yes.
Yeah. Right. Yeah.
I mean, like that's just one of the most interesting things now is like if you could condense all of humanity down to a simple pie chart, I think that would be a very useful thing for people to do. But like I've talked about this with my powerlifting group. It's things like the more compressed things get into just small little infographics, the more like inherently reductionist it gets, and the more it's done on social media, the more inherently reductionist it gets because it just doesn't respect the complexity of the human body or just just general physics. So it gets very, very hard to have any sort of these nuanced or like contextually driven conversations just because it's such a shitty medium for communication in general. And unless you're putting out like a 40-minute IGTV video, which nobody's going to watch the full thing of, it's really, really hard.
Yeah. Well, that's the conundrum, right? Is that, I mean, do you post stuff that is going to have an impact, or do you post stuff that's extremely accurate? And whose fault is it that we have to choose between that? Is it our fault that we're not good enough at being entertaining and engaging as we articulate this stuff, or is it just the fact that people are stupid? And you know, I think it's both, but this is probably where most people struggle. Like, well, I should say most ethical people struggle is what do you do, right? Like, do you focus on trying to get people just in the door and then level them up? I think that's the only responsible thing that you can do if you want to have an impact, is you have to try and get them in with something that's relatable to them, and then just do your best to then continue to lift and add the nuance and the context and whatnot, and just try and get better and better at winning that journey of entry to, you know, onboarding into higher education stuff, right? And I think if there's anything that's been like the main thing that's been responsible for our success and growth as N1 has been that, because we've not really marketed at all, and our content is pretty mundane, right? Especially on our brand pages. Like there's not, you know, if you're looking for, you know, a lot of the scantily dressed, you know, chicks and butt shots and things like that, like you're not going to find them, right? You know, and if you're looking at like at ripped abs, you're definitely not going to find them on my page right now. So it's very, yeah, it's very dry information dense, you know, and we've just kind of drudged that away, but we've basically tried to get it down to the simplest things of like, hey, you know, maybe don't fling up a leg curl if you want it to be more hamstrings and not quads. And like, that's a point where a person can come in, right? Without having to like, cause all they got to do, like, it's like, you got to start people at things that either have a wow factor visually or something that can instantly try and apply, without you having to, like, it has to be so simple that it doesn't take a lot of explanation to convince them to try it. And then it has to have enough of an impact there that they're like, oh, this is something. Now I want to know a little bit more in the next phase. And this is why sensation-based training is so dangerous and drove everybody into like doing the stupidest fucking exercises possible.
And why it's so popular now.
You could be like, hey, take this thing and do jujitsu to yourself and then try and squeeze. And I bet you're going to like feel the hardest contraction that you've ever felt. And I'm like, yeah. You know, shoot yourself with a taser and get the same thing. It's not necessarily.
It's not hypertrophy. That's not.
Well, I mean, you just got to have the right time under tension. That's all, right?
You tase your quad for 45 minutes a day.
Yeah, right. So it's just all about hitting your MRV every day. So
exactly,
got to up the voltage, you know, as you adapt.
But like, I think that's a really good point too about all of this like sensation or sensory based training where it's really, really easily marketable because you can get somebody to do something. It's like you said, you can just isometrically flex your bicep and you're going to feel like the biggest contraction that you can get, but that doesn't necessarily mean that it's contributing to anything other than just general global fatigue. But it's really sexy and easy to sell on Instagram, and I can make a reel about it with one line per slide that makes people just, oh, okay, I get this and I can do this right away. And it's very applicable to them, or they feel like it's applicable to them because they immediately feel something. Whereas any of the more nuanced stuff that you're talking about, there may not necessarily be that feeling acutely, but it may be more of a chronic adaptation or a chronic result of what they're doing.
Yeah, I know some solid coaches, especially ones that are in like the booty sphere, right? Where like they kind of have that following and they do a bunch of those type of programs. And they will get complaints if they don't have like quote unquote finishers and those type of things in the program. And it's so with the sensation thing, it's kind of that you have to realize that like, well, with great power, if you will, with great amount of feelings comes great responsibility. And that like, because you could use that to convince somebody to do absolute dog shit, or you could know like, look, there's a few viable options that we can do that are going to be relatively high from a sensation perspective or close to that, either because the muscle's fairly short or, you know, we're going to keep it under tension and we're going to build up some metabolite and get more of the burny feel and the blood restriction and the pumps, whatever. Like you can gain the system to be able to get, you know, positive adherence to something good. But the problem is that it's like all of a sudden then it's like you just realize that like, hey, like if I just give these people treats at all, like they don't even have to be good treats, right? I mean, they could literally be, you know, arsenic, you know, just flavored with little stevia and like it's all natural, organic. And they'll take it because they just keep getting that like that sensation based thing. And so that's the problem is just like many things when it comes to dealing with a population that doesn't have a high education in that respective field, industry, whatever, is that it's your ability to manipulate that base is huge. And I think as soon as people figured out like, oh, like if I just post these things that are just like crazy and whatever, that's going to get me far more, you know, engagement and far more followers, and people are going to want to buy these programs because nobody ever like writes up a thing like, man, my coach is so awesome. When I was doing this, the mechanics were just freaking great. Like, no, they're either post like, oh, this felt so good, or it burned so hard, or I was so dead or sore for a million years. And you're like, if you're an educated person, you're reading that, it's like, okay, I can probably tell that this program was likely absolute shit. But this person is in love with that shit because they've essentially been trained through that feedback. And it's very hard to get people out of that, right? Like it's very hard for people to get to the point where they understand like you got people need to understand that training is not competing, right? So you do not have to die crossing the goal line every workout. And every set doesn't need to be taken to failure, and every exercise doesn't need to be the most burniest, mind-blowing pump thing that you've like ever done, right? Like that's the reality. Like I got a bunch of questions from people, like, when they're using like the narrow stance leg press to kind of line up the glutes a little bit more. And you're like, I don't really feel like a deep stretch in my glutes when I'm doing this or whatever. And it's like, well, one, it's not as stretched as your glutes can get because we're constrained to the leg press. But also it's because most of the stuff that you've been doing has been either acrobats or short position. Like they're relating the sensation of one environment to a totally different environment. And so they're going to skip out on 3/4 of the things that are going to be beneficial for them just because they don't come with the same caveat sensation of the top of a glute bridge exercise, because like, well, that's a short position that holds the blood and the lactate and the acid in there. And so people are like, oh yeah, this is a really feely exercise. So now any exercise that's actually like high tension, but not super feely, I'm just going to assume isn't working.
Well, it's like that. The example there, like an easy example there would be like an RDL versus a hamstring curl. It's like you barely ever feel your hamstrings in RDLs until like the day or two afterwards, where you're like, oh my God, I feel like I get hit in the back of the legs with a bat.
Yeah. Well, unless you just raise your toes and just stretch the nerves, right?
Yeah, then you feel it right away. Then you feel it right away.
Yeah,
but like that's one of those things where like what you were talking about too with the short term and like the flashiness and the sexiness. Like Kyle and I've talked about that at length on other podcasts or with our groups, and like we built our followings, and Kyle specifically built his following off of like warm up and prep stuff.
Mm-hmm.
And it blew up really fast because again, it's like those high sensation stuff that people just like crave so they can feel like they're doing something without actually working very hard. And then when Kyle started like posting, but then like the unfortunate side effect about that is like the population that we ended up attracting, like for a long time, we were known as just the warm up guys. It's like, they don't actually train people. All they do is just lay on the ground and warm shit up. And it's like, well, what do we, and like that was a hard pill for me to swallow, because like I would start getting people coming to me and being like, I want to power lift, but I want to work with you so I can get out of pain, and then I'm going to go hire a real coach and get like really strong. It's like that feels terrible. So like it's one of those things where as a demographic and as people who are like creating content, we have to be very cognizant of the content that we're putting out to see if it's matching the demographic that we want to attract.
Yeah, you don't want to be known as the fluffer coaches.
Yeah. I'm that guy that's like, yeah, he's going to get me healthy, get me out of pain, and then I'm going to go get like actually strong with somebody else. It's like, this sucks. Like,
no, it's the reaction that people were giving me when like I started posting more of the actual training, because in my head I was like, well, how many times can you watch a trap bar deadlift or a bench press or whatever? So I'll just do some of these other things. And then people are like, oh, you actually train too? And I'm like, oh, wow.
The key,
I gotta change the message.
Yeah.
The key, Kyle, is you can post all of the trap bar deadlift videos that you want. You just have to have the right ass and the right camera view.
Yes.
Right.
I got to get that the rear view on.
Get them TikTok leggings.
The up angle. The
yes.
Up angle and the posterior view of it.
And them TikTok leggings, and you'll blow up.
Yep. Then basically all you got to do is just like change your color scheme, and you can record the same workout, the same video, the same exercises just over and over and over again.
Colors, right? You're good to go. Just different outfits.
Mm-hmm. So, or you just strategically place your, your caffeinated, beverage of choice in a different location.
Yes, with the label, of course, facing the camera.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Matt and I are short on sponsors. Neither one of us are pretty enough for that. So we are unsponsored all the way.
Yes, we're unsponsorable, I think, is what it really comes down to.
Yeah. I can send you guys all of the people that I offend when they offer us a sponsorship, and I'm just like, sorry, it's outside of our moral compass to take sponsorships from.
Just be like, but
such
these
things.
guys have no morals.
Yeah,
so
these guys have no ethics. They'll take it.
just send it down.
Yeah.
Send them down our way.
These guys are both really broke. Send them. Like, they'll take whatever you say.
Yeah, they'll take that. We're good.
The irony is like when you get offered the sponsorships for things that you're like actively speaking out against. Like when I get offered a sponsorship for a company that sells like booty bands, or something, I'm just like, okay. This is like, okay, so do you want to send me some free ones? And what I'll do is I'll make an Instagram post of me like cutting them in half, and burning them and shooting them, and you know.
My favorite sponsorship that I ever got. This happened in like September when I was still like on the way up to trying to like get to like 260-ish, 265. I got a sponsored like a DM for maternity wear, and I was like, "Oh, this is hitting a little too close to home." Guess bulk's going a little too well.
Oh, that's awesome. I don't know that I have one that is that good.
Yeah, I gotta see if I still have that one because I sent that all. It's definitely on my story archives because I was like, I finally made it, guys. I've got a maternity wear sponsorship. I'm ready.
I always get like the supplement companies that have. I'll look at their page and they have like 200,000 followers, and then I'll like click on a post and it's like 30 likes, and I'm like, huh?
Yeah,
that doesn't match.
What's happening here? It's just you're not as popular as you would like to believe, I guess.
Fake ingredients, fake followers.
Yeah, just fake all the way.
Yeah.
So speaking of fake all the way, I think this brings us up to our only scripted question of the day, and I think we've left hopefully enough time because this one could go really long. But so Kassem, I got your name right. So this is not going to be the grind your gears part. That's no longer going to be the part that gets you pissed off. What in fitness and what is the biggest thing that you see like on social media or in the fitness industry now that really like just really irritates you and like really like actually gets under your skin? Because you do always present yourself as a very even-keeled person who's very logical and very rational with the ways that you're presenting content or the way that you're looking for debate. So what do you see that makes you like, oh, fuck this in particular, I hate this? If you want to name names, feel free, and we'll just link them in the next podcast.
Besides us.
Besides us, yes. We're exempt from this one. We already know you hate us.
To be honest, it is the lack of like foundational sciences that so many people that, you know, consider themselves experts or high level or whatnot have. And that basically that's what kind of creates the barrier of communication, makes it hard to debate, creates most of the stupid fights. Like most people are fighting over stupid shit when, you know, it's like, man, if you knew like 5 minutes of physics, then we wouldn't have this disagreement right now, you know, or if you just knew your anatomy was a little bit better, then we would be fine right now. But I think that's the biggest thing, because one, it's really hard to debate those people and not sound condescending. And it's also really boring to debate people when instead of talking about the nuances of things, that instead you're just having to go back to like really white belt. I mean, because let's just be honest, physics is not that sexy. It's pretty boring, and it is pretty dry, right? And so when we're talking about like the debacles that have happened recently with like the rib cage and the bench press and stuff like that, and it's to me, it's the amount of bickering that there is about stuff that should be so fundamentally simple that it's getting in the way of us having like better conversations. And that's why I'm just hoping more and more people actually do their due diligence of upping their foundational level of stuff, right? Because like, you know, let's say that I wanted to go and have, you know, a conversation with somebody about research. If they don't have the basic stuff on anatomy and physics, we can't actually talk about the studies yet. So we have to like go back to like, you know, we have to go back to like the kindergarten level stuff before we can even talk about the data and what that means. And I think that's the most frustrating point for me, because it just gets in the way of the conversations that I want to have and forces me into a lot of conversations that are, you know, dare I say beneath me, but they're definitely beneath the level that I want to be speaking at this point in time. Right. And I know it's a challenge because there's always somebody that's coming in, and this is they're brand new. This is the first exposure, and that's always as an educator, it's always a challenge of understanding that like your path may be this like linear thing that you've been achieving and you've been upgrading your knowledge and your understanding, but somebody is still coming in at day one all the time. And I'm willing to accept that, for the people that are sending us money and coming to courses and whatnot, of meeting them there at day one, right? But for the people that have been in the industry forever and they've built a status, and then when they come in with the same arguments and opinions as the person that's at day one, I'm like, look, I really don't want to spend half my day explaining this to you for free, right? Just for the sake of like Instagram stature, like in status and settling this debate. Like, I feel like I have to participate in the clown world and without getting compensated far too often, because nobody does their due diligence of making sure that they have a foundational education that is broad enough to support their specialized knowledge and experience.
And I think the point that you brought up about the day ones versus the 10-year veterans is a very, very important thing to bring up too, because like you said, there's always going to be new people coming in, and that's fine. And like the good thing about what you guys are doing and what a lot of people are trying to do now is that they're trying to leave the field better than when we came in. Mm-hmm. Right. And there's a lot of other people who are not trying to make the field better at all. And they're trying to keep things the exact same. And like, that's the biggest difference that I would say, or like that I personally think with the difference between the day ones versus the 10-year veterans, is like, you can have a better conversation with the day one people, because you also know that you're not going to have to unteach them a whole bunch of shit. Like, it's like your slate is blank. We can just start where we need to start, and we can get you going a lot better, and we can give you a much better point to start from, as opposed to these 10-year people where it's like, you need to, like you were saying, dig back and go all the way back to the beginning of your time and try to get rid of all of the stuff, like try to like change the foundational understanding of all the stuff that you've learned in the past.
Yeah. And I think this is where technology is a double-edged sword, right? Because it gives us the opportunity to create a higher entry level, right? Because we can provide so many resources that are at that foundational lower level, so that somebody before they get to where they're in an in-person course or whatnot, we can provide them with so much information. But that goes both ways. We can also misguide people more than ever. And I think right now, some people argue that like just the more information that's out there, the better. And that's the beauty of the internet and technology, is there's just an abundance. And in reality, because things are like, a video is infinitely scalable, right? Like, we can all watch, like the whole world can decide they want to watch the same video on a bicep curl if they choose. And so we don't need an infinite amount of information. What we need is the quality information to be accessible to more people. And I think we need, we'll say, to quote the Rock, right? We need more people to like know their roles and shut their mouth. And that's not necessarily a thing just to be condescending, but it's a thing to look like, if you aren't in the position to be teaching this, like you guys have seen that illustration probably, where it's like, in order to teach this much and it's a small circle, you need to know this much, and it's a huge circle. And I feel like with social media, what people try and do is they try and teach at the edge of their like limit of understanding, like constantly, because that's what's the most interesting to them. And so what we have is we have an abundance of people speaking at the edge of their understanding, which means we have an abundance of stuff that is lower quality. Whereas if we get everybody following that principle of like, hey, there's probably something really valuable that you can do and that you can deliver to people right now. And it may not be the thing that is the most interesting to you right now, because what's the most interesting thing to us tends to be what we are learning. But what we are learning is not what we should be teaching.
Experts in that,
yeah.
Right. Yeah. Right. Like, it's what we should be practicing. And I have, like, from managing trainers at the corporate level to even here at N1, that's always a constant battle because you're excited about it. You want to go tell people about it and whatnot. And then all of a sudden somebody hits you with that question and you're like, oh, fuck. Right. Like, because you don't have that experience yet. Right. Or you're not articulating it well. And I think that that just kind of feeds into the original problem is that, if we have this abundance of poor information, then the people that haven't done their due diligence of going back and getting that foundation, they think that they're in even this higher spot. And it's like, you're not really higher. Everybody else there's just a lot more people down below. And so that having that perspective can be really misleading. Right. And that's where, trying to compare yourself to the people that are the best and comparing yourself to your former self are better ways of kind of evaluating where you are than trying to compare where you are to everybody that's like below or the average person, right? Because the average person in this industry is far from an expert, right? We all have our own body, but it seems to be the thing that as a human population that very, very, very few people know the most fundamental things about taking care of themselves, both from a physical and a psychological standpoint, right? And that's a huge philosophical conversation on its own.
Yeah, that ends up being one of the most dangerous things about social media, because you'll get some of these young people who have had exposure to one thing, and that is the one thing that is right, and it's the only thing that's correct, and in their mind there's nothing else that's wrong about it. And they meet some like-minded people when they do that one particular thing, and then if they post about something on social media and somebody slightly disagrees with their perspective, the people who they've met immediately jump in on it. And instead of having the ability to have a discussion where it's like, hey, I think this is wrong because of X, Y, and Z, I would love to have a discussion about it. You get a bunch of people bandwagoning in and just like circling the wagons around this one person, defending them with no actual information and just personal attacks about that other person. About like the biggest one that's happening now in powerlifting is like when people start talking about anything related to like movement or anything like that, they just go like, oh, what's your total? It's like, I don't care. Like, it doesn't, that's not the point that I'm bringing up in this. That's a completely unrelated thing. Like it's a really, really interesting spot for people to be in, because they just, it basically ends up being like, they just tag in their big brother, and their big brother comes and kicks the ass of of like this new person.
Mm-hmm.
It's a hard place for people to be in social media, because it things like that seem to prevent the ability to have more discussions about it.
Yeah. Which, that continues, like, this is an easy thing for me to rant on this topic, is like coaches, and this goes to all of my students, all of my followers, whatever, like, stop copying my shit. And when I mean stop copying my shit, I don't mean like stealing my shit per se, as much as I mean, like, I am not marketing to the beginner level fitness person. I am marketing to other coaches. And what we see a ton of is all of the coaches and students that we have, they just try and emulate what we're doing, right? And so they're sitting here talking about like iliac lat, stuff, and it's like your person like doesn't know what a lat is, right? Let alone an iliac lat. Do you think they know what an ilium is? How are they going to know what an iliac lat is? They don't know what a lat or an iliac, like, And so that doesn't do them any service at all, right? Like the coaches that actually get it and speak to their audience make way more money and get way more clients with what they do with their social media. But also, then what happens is they tag me like, oh, Kassem, somebody came on my page and disagreed and they're talking mean to me. Like, can you please come help me and explain to them? And I'm like, wait a second. I'm out here trying to teach you guys, putting free information out. And what you're doing is you're turning that into more work for me by doing a bad job of copying it on your platform and then asking me to come help you when you didn't do a good job stealing my shit. So
just share the post.
Yeah,
just share the original post.
Yeah, just share the post, right?
Just share the post with like some thumbs up signs or something. And
yeah,
good. Like,
or like take the knowledge, but then disseminate down the most simplest portion that's relevant to your people, right? If needed, right? Like I'm out here I don't post content to help other people boost their social media following. I post content to try and make coaches better coaches and deliver a better service, right? And so that's a huge pet peeve, right? It's like, yeah, it sucks when people just steal your shit and don't credit you, but it also sucks when people steal your shit. They're crediting you, but they're doing it it's almost worse when somebody copies something that you do and then they completely botch it, because then a part of what you're doing gets associated with that like lower quality version, right? So
yeah, you and I were actually talking about that yesterday, where if you lose, it's way worse to be half wrong than it is to be completely wrong.
Yeah. Because then people dismiss the part of the argument that was right or true, as well, right? Because it's like it's a black or white, it's a winner lose thing, right?
I mean, I think basically all of our podcasts come down to everybody hates social media, but we all have to use it. And like all of the guests that we've had are just like begrudgingly on social media. We just sound like such grizzled old get off my lawn people, where it's like, I don't want to do this anymore, but I realize that I have to do it.
Well, the reality is that reason only exists because we don't have an alternative, right? Like there isn't an equivalent in terms of the marketing or marketing outside of social media. Like people think that like to do marketing outside of social media takes a lot of money and a lot of skill and whatever, right? And so it's that appeal that like, well, it doesn't cost any money and it takes very little time to put stuff on social, and you have a massive audience because of that, privacy grabbing infrastructure that they have built for us, right? Whereas it's like, oh, it's free outside of the cost of everything that is you being known to the people
your
that
morals,
want to extract your wealth and your psychological health. And maybe somebody will solve that problem from a technological perspective, because imagine there was a fitness gram, and basically all it was just like, hey, this is just fitness information, and the only people that actually can post are people with X amount of like qualified individuals. It's not just like anybody shares. It's right,
like almost like a test to get in and apply.
So yeah, I mean, that's kind of what we're starting a platform called N1 Plus. I don't know if it'll be out before or after this launches, but essentially that's just what we're doing. Is we're trying to create a social media feed that's not only going to be an archive of our content, but it's going to be like content that we've handpicked from people that we respect and put on the platform. So it's like, instead of like trying to decide through the feed, we can actually say, hey, if you appreciate what we do and the way that we think, here are some other voices and some other information, and that's just going to be there, like just as another alternative. Plus I can't get kicked off my own platform.
That's always the best part, is when you're the king of the castle, you can't get kicked out.
Yeah, it's a weird time right now, and it hit me right after the new year of how much it was impacting me that I'm not able to speak open-minded on social, that I'm always consciously like gagging myself a little bit in terms of what I'm saying. And it's like, wow, I need to be off this platform, because that is having it's coming out in the tone that I'm speaking to people with, and like my temper's just shorter and all that. And I've had to apologize more in the last couple months, just because my overall experience on social, like I'm not used to having to write a post and then having to like delete things over time and like reread it and think it or whatever, and I definitely think there's a huge negative psychological impact to that. And I know a lot of people that are on these platforms right now, whatever their views are, right, in some way, shape, or form. I don't think it matters which side of the fence you sit on. There's probably things that you would say that you don't say right now, because we're just so afraid to have an opinion about anything, even if it's a very, very rational, like neutral opinion.
Yeah. I got nothing to say to that one. Yeah. I mean, it's
see, you guys can't even have an opinion on that.
Yeah, no, I mean, like it's one of those ones that like, like a statement like that hits very close to home, because that's exactly what I feel like when I'm posting my content or doing anything like that at all, where it's like, what can I say that I will like have to do the least amount of work for afterwards, to either fix or change or apologize for, or what am I going to post that's going to be the one thing that somebody from this other circle, this other 3-letter acronym circle that doesn't like us anymore, reports me for and gets my account banned, and then removes my entire ability to market to all the people that are following me.
Yeah. All 6,000 of them.
All 6,500 now. We're going up. We're going up.
Matt's all about the quality, man.
I'm all about the quality of them followers.
Yeah, right? Yeah. I mean, you don't get maternity sponsorships for nothing.
Exactly.
Right.
He's reaching something.
I'm reaching high. But I think this is an awesome conversation. I think it's a good spot of any to end the podcast. So, Kassem, thank you very much for joining us today, and we really appreciate your time. And I think this is a good conversation that we'll be able to share with pride and no worries about editing and apologizing for later.
Yeah, we're too lazy to edit anyway.
Yeah. Yeah. Better to be canceled than ask for forgiveness. Right?
Exactly.
Yeah. But thank you so much for coming on.
Yeah.
Really
Thank you guys. Anytime.
Awesome. Real quick, where can everybody find you?
Oh yes, we gotta do
This is how bad we are at this.
Yeah.
Website, social media, all that good stuff.
If you would like people to find you.
Yeah. What was your address again, Matt? I'm just, so you can find our exercise library articles, videos at n1.training, and the Instagram ID is the same thing, n1.training. All of our course content, as well as the archive of all of our coaches, if you're looking to hire an N1 coach, are at n1.education. And again, the Instagram handle is the same. If you want to follow me and all my bullshit, it's at coach_Kassem. That's KASSEM.
No Z?
No Z.
Yeah.
No Z.
No Z. Yeah, just, come with caution, no, you got to sign a waiver, terms and conditions, not responsible for anything. I mean, honestly, the biggest difference between what I speak and the brand speaks is like the brand is, I try and keep the brand very neutral in terms of like any opinions that might ruffle people's feathers or whatnot. And I'm just not afraid to go there.
I enjoy the entertainment aspect.
It's always fun.
So.
It's always fun.
Yeah.
Kyle and I always we'll always DM each other a post of yours and be like, "This is about me, isn't it?" And he's like, "No, this one's about me." It's we just go back and forth like, which one of us is he talking shit about? And then we'll get a DM from you with the kissy face of the post, and it's like, "Oh, okay, it was me. I was right. I win this one. I won this round."
Yeah, I mean, I just try and get you guys in there, every once in a while, so you don't think that I am only ripping on other people in the industry.
Listen, it keeps us honest, and we actually enjoy the feedback, so I'm okay with it for sure.
Yeah, absolutely. It's one of those things where Kyle and I always want to improve what we're trying to do, and we're trying to give to the people that we work with. So whenever we get feedback like that, we actually appreciate it, and we don't get emotionally upset and start posting passive aggressive stories. We don't just start sharing stories about you.
No, you're not gonna make a video in like a wig and some short shorts and stuff like that. With a play on my name, something like that.
That's not our model.
Awesome, man. Thank you so much.
You're welcome, guys. Talk to you later.